Yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in. This is presumably going to be the second episode of this podcast series, even though it's the first one that we're actually recording. Today we have this fantastic drummer and beyond named Bryan Kopchak. Yeah, plays drums, plays electronics, leads a jam session at Quinn's in Beacon, does some booking, does some kind of community organizing, and does sound at the Falcon, all these sorts of things. So, but yeah, we just wanted to do this series and kind of like get down with all these different artists and talk about art, talk about their process, talk about what they're thinking about, talk about goals and stuff like that. So, I think one of the first things actually that I was thinking about, there were a few things that came to mind that I wanted to talk to you about specifically, but even one of the first things that came to mind is just to continue our discussion yesterday. We were talking on the phone yesterday about, you brought up like the loft scene in New York City, so this is like New York City downtown in the 70s into the early 80s, You mentioned that, and I immediately was thinking about like Sam Rivers and people like this. But I wanted to hear you talk about that, to hear you talk about what the things about that scene are that are like that really catch your eye. What's alluring to you about that?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know too much about the loft scene. I mean, obviously, I'm very young. I didn't experience it. I don't know firsthand what it actually entails, but I have, kind of a dream in my head of what I imagine that looked like.
Yeah.
And even if it's not what it was, I think pertaining to what we were talking about, which was hosting a jam session here, and having like a sort of workshop with the musicians, or at least just having a session. And because this space isn't really susceptible to, it's not a bar, and there's not patrons to, entertain or anything, we can actually utilize it as a space to like talk about our creative process and, talk about the things that don't get discussed on the bandstand, and like I said, I don't know much about the loft scene, but I imagine it probably created a space similar to that where, guys were workshopping ideas, bringing what they had to the table, and, figuring out how to make it work, So that's one thing I would like to facilitate, not just here, but in, another, at my jam session, or in the Hudson Valley period, just creating a community of musicians is really important to me.
Yeah.
It's always been my dream.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think that's the big thing that was coming up, because it's, obviously we didn't experience the loft scene there, and we can only talk to people who were there, which they're fewer and fewer every day. Cats aren't getting any younger for sure. But I think still there's like...
Have you met anybody from...
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Because sure it's like, Threadgill, and like there was this time that Threadgill and I were walking. We were walking to this Italian joint like on Great Jones Street, Great Jones Way. And he pointed out like, that's the building. That's where Studio Rivby was. That's where Sam Rivers' loft was, know. So we talked about that a little bit, and I was just looking at that thing, last night, the thing I sent you, right? And Steve Coleman was talking about getting to New York, because he got to New York in like 76, I think. And getting there and hanging out at these different loft scenes. A bunch of the cats had spaces going on. But in a way, what seems important to me is like the symbol of it. The question is more about like what does that symbolize to you? And then the question is like, what do you think that what do you feel a lack of in the scene in the Hudson Valley? Or what do you feel like you haven't been experiencing with the community that you're really looking for more of? That's more what the question is about. Not so much a historical question, but it's like, what is this symbolizing to you? You know, what's the thing that you're aiming for that you think that we can get to as a group of artists, as a community?
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Man, I don't think I have a specific vision of what it looks like, or more importantly, what it sounds like. I think that's like something that will come about as, you know, if this type of thing continues, like it'll just reveal itself over time, you know. I think, you know, the Hudson Valley compared to the city, we're a lot more spread out. So, you know, I don't feel like it lessens the opportunity for a sense of community. It's like people have to drive an hour to feel a sense of community, which is like, I think a lot of people just living in their own, like, I don't know, where I live, it's like I don't have a community. Mm-hmm. You know, it's very densely populated, yet, you know, no one's really coming together over anything. There's no art, there's no culture, you know. Yeah. So but, you know, from time to time, little places like this pop up where all of a sudden there's a hub for people to come to. Mm-hmm. You know, and even when I was younger, when I was in high school, you know, I was playing in punk bands and, you know, rock bands and stuff like that. Like, there was a scene. Like, I caught the tail end of that, of just a scene of young people that, and it was spread out between a couple different venues, but it was like there was all these bands that everybody knew, and, you know, kind of ska was like the big thing. So,
yeah,
you know, and I really loved that as a kid, and, you know, I want to create more of that. But now, as a jazz musician, you know, having a love for that, and then, you know, there's a couple colleges in the area that are, you know, producing some musicians, and you know, I've always had like a gripe with like music school, as I'm sure like I know you do, and a lot of musicians do, you know. And I didn't go to music school, so maybe I'm just like I'm just jealous. You know?
Nah, man, nothing to be jealous about.
But, you know, I'm like primarily self-taught, and I, you know, just learn through experience. I learn through playing with other people and listening. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think one thing I noticed from a lot of musicians who take the academic route, and I'll say take it too seriously, is that they kind of get pigeonholed into this academic way of thinking, and most of what they play is, you know, it's very, there's curriculum, it's very structured, but there's not a lot of playing with people, you know, there's not a lot of just hands-on experience. And it's like, I feel like, you know, when you listen to the greats, you know, it's like they didn't go to school for that, you know, they didn't have that. The school was playing, and you know, so, but there's also like an attitude that comes along with, you know, you hear the stories of, you know, these guys getting into fights, and, you know, it's just very real, it's very raw, and like, you know, I don't want to instigate any fights, you know, but having a, you know, a community of people that are interacting and sharing ideas and aren't afraid to say like, yo, that didn't sound good tonight.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah,
like,
yeah.
And, you know, and also being humble enough to accept criticism, you know, or, you know, welcome it from other people, you know. like, you know, I think personally speaking, there's a lot of, you know, things about jazz history and the tradition of the music and that I'm not aware of, and I've over time gained some insights, but you know, I don't have access to too many, you know, mentors, you know, that I do have some, you know, but yeah, over time there's been things that I'm learning that I'm starting to piece together, like, oh, this is, you know, how I function as a drummer in this situation, or, you know, or this is how the music is meant to be played, or not, I shouldn't say meant to be played, but, you know, a way of, yeah, I don't know, just a way of processing all of it. Yeah, I've had to learn that through the experience, you know, and yeah, and I think that would be good for a lot of people in the area, especially the younger musicians, you know, and then also for older musicians to share their wisdom, you know.
Yeah.
Because there's some great musicians in this area.
There's some insane musicians in this area. Yeah. That was one of the interesting things to me about coming up here, was just seeing how many incredible older and elder musicians are up here, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's certainly people that are kind of like the creme de la creme of the scene, but then there are a lot of cats that, you know, maybe didn't get that same level of notoriety, but they still have, you know, just as much experience and wisdom about the music and all of this kind of thing. And it's, you know, that's one of the interesting things about being up here, is because it is a little bit fractured in a way, you know. There's, as you're saying, I mean, I sense a lot of that too. There's not as strong a sense of community. There are not as many like hubs. It's, you know, it's not like being in the city. It's not like, you know, and even in the city, in a way, there's not, it doesn't feel, it doesn't feel like the city has the same kind of, you know, community thing as, you know, what we think the loft scene had. Right. You know, from what I've heard about it, the loft scene was like, you know, somebody had a loft and everybody went there to play, and they would just hang out and play all the time and do concerts there and this kind of thing, and they would hold rehearsals there, and, you know, maybe some of them would have workshops there. You know, obviously some of the cats are more like, have a kind of teaching tit. You know, Sam Rivers was somebody that really like shared a lot of information through different mediums and really brought people together to rehearse them, you know. So there's not even as much of that in the city right now, I think, which is like,
you know. I mean, I try to avoid the city as much as I can, you know. But from what I've heard of the people who go to the jam sessions down there, I've always heard of it to be very competitive, and like stories of just like all the schools being rivals of each other. Like, oh, that guy went to Manhattan. You know, screw that guy. And, So I don't know. Maybe it's not like that now, you know. But I knew when I created my jazz jam up at Quinn's, you know, that I didn't want that vibe. I didn't want a sense of competition. And we've talked about this, and like, I do think there can be a healthy degree of competition, or just, you know, something that's like a fire that inspires you to, you know, progress individually, you know. But I just didn't want it to be pretentious, and maybe it's not up to me if it's perceived that way, you know. Maybe that's just, you know, somebody feels that way and somebody doesn't feel that way, you know. Exactly. So it doesn't really matter.
People are gonna always just feel the way that people feel. You know, right. So you don't really get any control over that in a way, but you know. So then I think there's a question too of like, you know, because we were talking about doing this thing here, and You know, when we spoke on the phone yesterday, it sounded like, in a way, you had a pretty clear vision of something musically that you're trying to get to, or an idea of what you want a band to do. You know, it feels like something that like isn't really happening right now. I wanted to talk about what that is for you. You know, what are some of the specifics in that?
Well, I think like a lot of the musicians who are able to work up here are kind of limited in a sense by like the venues that they play at. Like most of the places that we can play are or find work are restaurants, breweries, you know, things like that, where you're competing with, you know, the business itself, you know, because it's like it's not really, these places aren't necessarily geared as like towards being in a listening environment, or most people don't even know there's going to be a band when they go to the brewery that day or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think it kind of forces a lot of musicians who are just trying to get by, you know, to stick to covers, or if they're playing jazz, like maybe it feels weak, you know, it feels reserved because they're not trying to offend anybody.
Yeah.
They want to keep their gig because there's not a lot of them.
Yeah.
You know, so and I've had that mentality on a lot of my gigs, and you know, it can really impede on like the creative process. And like one thing I'm realizing after doing this for long enough and being in a lot of different situations, and especially from like working at Quinn's, and seeing, you know, like being a part of the Monday Night Jazz session there, like, you know, we got all kinds of stuff, like from, you know, traditional swing stuff to like, you know, just really out, like almost unbearable, you know, in a ramen restaurant, you know?
Yeah.
But it was weird because it was really hard to gauge like how somebody would do that night, you know, because it could be the most out stuff in the world, and yet people would go nuts, you know? Or it could be like really great straight ahead stuff or accessible stuff, and nobody cares. Nobody's, you know? So it was a really interesting thing to witness, and I'm trying to like, you know, look at the whole situation and be like, so what works? You know, what works and what doesn't? And over time, like, you know, I think some things, like, I think some nights, like, you're just at the mercy of the moment. I mean, we're always kind of at the mercy of the moment. You know, you're dealing with the audience members. They're all bringing, like, an energy to the space that you're in. It's not just the musicians, you know? So sometimes it's not you, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's just like, it was a shitty night, and that's what it is, you know?
Yeah.
But if there was anything I could take away, like, I think, I don't know, there's like a certain level of like authenticity and intention and like being deliberate, being connected to what you're doing, being connected to the space that you're in, to the audience, to the musicians on stage, to yourself. You know, like, the more that I felt that as a listener, I felt like that fostered what I would consider a good night at Quinn's, you know?
Yeah.
You know, when there was avant-garde music, or or regular swing music, whatever it was, if I could tell that the musicians were too in their head, or were too concerned with themselves, or they were only concerned with the band and not the audience, like, you could tell it, you could feel it, most importantly. Like, most audience members, when they're listening to music, they don't, unless they're a musician themselves or they deeply study music, like, they're not concerned with what chords you're playing.
Mm-hmm.
They don't care how fast you can play your arpeggios and your scales and all that shit,
Yeah.
They want to feel something.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
That's all they want.
Absolutely.
And that's what I want to facilitate in a community of musicians in the Hudson Valley. Is like, I want to talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I want, I want to keep working in the Hudson Valley. I want to make the Hudson Valley a beautiful place to experience art and music,
Yeah.
But I want to be deliberate about what that standard is, like.
Absolutely.
And.
Absolutely.
And we don't get to that if we don't talk about it,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, it's just gonna be.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. And I don't want to suggest...
So here's your platform. Let's set that standard. Like,
yeah,
get into it as specifically as you want, because you're starting to touch on something that we've talked about. We've known each other for like a year and a half now, and this has been such a major thread through many of our conversations about playing music, about structuring improvisation, all this kind of thing, Mm-hmm. So here's your platform now. Set the standard, like, be really specific, about your vision. What does it mean to connect to the audience? What does that mean to create this like emotional experience? How do you convey that emotional experience? In your mind, what's the kind of prime example of being able to do that? What does that look like?
Yeah, I feel like that's obviously going to be different for every individual person. Mm-hmm. I think for me, I feel the best, or I feel the most accomplished at a gig when I'm relaxed, and I can take accountability for when that's on me, when it's like, if I'm tired, or or I had a crappy day and that's influencing my mood and that's preventing me from relaxing,
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, that's my own personal thing, and like, I need to go and meditate or whatever, do something to, relax. Also, my facility on the instrument, my mm-hmm. if I haven't practiced in a while, that's gonna make it harder to relax,
Sure.
But sometimes not. Sometimes I can not practice for a while and just sit down, and it's like, oh, wow, it's like I never even stopped,
Right.
So that can be interesting.
Well, so here's the point, though. I mean, you're bringing up facility, and a minute ago you were talking about, like, well, it's not about this, like, running your scales, all this kind of thing. Okay, so in this context, what does facility mean? Right? Because facility this is like a really general term, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of people, and I think there's a lot of drummers going through school, and to them, facility is being able to play paradiddles at 400 BPM, right, or whatever. Right. It has this kind of very quantitative thing, and you're talking about something that is outside of that. You're talking about going a different kind of way, and that's what I'm really trying to get us to in this discussion is like, so what specifically does that mean? What does facility mean in this context?
Yeah, I guess when you put it that way, like, it kind of pertains more to the group. It pertains more to the people that you're playing with, like having a good relationship with them, or being able to feel free to be yourself, because that's the thing that the audience is connecting to the most, is your vulnerability, or your willingness to bare your soul, and to emote through your instrument. I think maybe that's the facility that I think needs a lot of improvement, is your how to convey emotion through your instrument.
Yeah. So in a way, the facility is it is a spiritual, emotional facility more than it is like a technical prowess playing the instrument.
Yeah, I think so. And it like, and there is a limit to how much of that you bring, because it's like you don't want to be so emotional, just like crying to people in front, like in this ramen restaurant, it's like, dude, we did not come here for this. Like, I'm sorry you're having a tough time, buddy. But like, so it's like and that comes back to being aware of the space that you're in. Like, I worked with a shaman for a while, and he would always say, like, we would talk about like, like our mystical, like, revelations, and this knowledge that we acquired, or just our mystical thoughts that we were thinking throughout the day, and then like feeling like we can't express that to just everybody. And he would always say, like, sometimes you really gotta like know your audience. You gotta know who you're talking to, because some people, it's not worth expelling this energy if they're not going to be able to receive it. So you kind of, it's another tool to be able to, you're not judging people necessarily, but you're feeling out the room, you're feeling like, is this, and you have to ask it within yourself, like, does this need to be expressed right now, or am I imposing this on people?
Yeah. Do you think that is something that's possible to be gauged and navigated in the traditional performance setting?
It's tough to say, because sometimes that raw emotion, like, sometimes that is really what needs to come out, and it creates an uncomfortable situation for some people. But maybe somebody is like, I needed that. I really needed to see somebody expressing that level of emotion, so that I can feel alive, or so that because I feel that, and so it's tough to quantify. I don't know. I mean, maybe, I think this is making me think, like, within improvisation, I think there needs to be limitation. I like free music, but there's something that can happen within like free experimental music where it's unpleasant, and maybe it's just unpleasant for me, but it's just like, if I don't feel some limitation, something to oppose that freedom, then I feel like there's not really much to gain from it, or I don't know, maybe some people like to just be in the chaos, and like I like chaos too, but I like when it returns, you know, when it resolves into a form or something, you know, that we can grab onto, you know, because that's our nature, is duality, you know. So, you know, maybe going into like a gig, you know, you're sussing the room out, and you're, you know, you're contemplating like, what's the vibe, what does this room need, you know, what do I need also to feel good about it, you know, and then creating a limitation out of that, creating like a framework of like, okay, we're not going to push it beyond this, but we're not going to let it stoop to nothing, you know.
Yeah. When you go into a room, what are some of your techniques for gauging a room?
Well, you know, this is something that I'm still always working on, you know. And if I can actually talk about it with the other musicians in the band, then there might be some, like, you know, progress to be made, or like, you know, to actually discuss like what the room feels like, or, you know, maybe it's not even the room, you know, but maybe it's just talking to, you know, noticing your conversation with the band members when you're setting up or something, you know, and maybe that says something about the, you know, how the night's gonna go, or I don't know, but I do think just talking about it and being open about it. I mean, you know, we had that gig at Quinn's over the summer. It was you, me, and Talio. And I came to that gig with a list of improvisational, you know, jump off kind of points, you know. And that was a great night, you know, because we were all like on the same page, and that was a really weird night too.
It was a weird night.
I was thinking about
that's what I was thinking about. It was so weird that night.
People were vibing each other, and it just had a heavy feeling. But we went outside, we stood in a circle, and we just kind of shook it all off, and we talked about, you know, some of those points that I made of like how we can, you know, like one of those was, you know, to trust that your bandmates will support you, you know, setting like an intention before playing of like, yo, I got your back, you know. It's maybe it happens in a lot of great bands and they don't even speak about it, but like, why not talk about it, you know? Why not be like, hey man, like, I got you tonight, or just be like, yo man, I can tell you're really stressed out right now, but like, whatever I can do to help you relax, like, so that we can have fun and we can create something special, you know. Like, just that honesty and vulnerability is kind of the main tool that we can use.
Yeah, sure.
You know?
Totally. Which in a way, a lot of those great bands, they just had that. They had that psychic shit, man. You know?
Yeah.
I think they all had that. You listen to Miles' band with like Wayne and Herbie and Tony and Ron. And I think they had that. You just dropped the label in the tea.
I did. It's all good. It's organic.
Yeah, they really had that kind of thing. They had that psychic thing that they seemed to be able to meet each other at any place.
And maybe they didn't have those kinds of discussions. I mean, back then, I'd be surprised if they did
like that. Yeah. I don't think he was doing any of these things that you're talking about.
No, probably not.
Yeah.
But there was also, I feel like, maybe just a different mentality about music back then. Also, there was more work.
Absolutely, man.
And yeah, like maybe they weren't thinking about how do we appease the audience, because that was entertainment back in the day. It's like you went out and you saw a band, like you saw live music,
right. Sure.
It's like now
the landscape has changed so much.
We're pressed with this responsibility of trying to figure out how to entertain people,
Yeah. Well, I mean, and maybe it's time too that we have to make a shift as musicians, and like actually we're not here to just try and appease the audience,
right?
Yes, this is the way it goes. You're gonna hear the music that we make, and trying to shift that perspective back a little bit,
But I also I hear that, and then I feel like it sounds a little too serious to be like, no, you're going to listen to this music, and you are going to like it. No. Yeah. I was thinking after my gig the other night, it was just like, yo, we're getting paid to have fun. And there's nothing wrong with that. And that's that's, for me, I know that's a personal struggle I have. I don't know why, but it's just like being paid to have fun. I feel guilty about that sometimes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's people who bust their ass to make a living,
right,
and they suffer, and it's not that I don't suffer in my own way,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's like we're getting paid to have fun, but I believe that if we're having fun, then there's a good chance the audience is going to have fun.
Yeah.
Or they're just going to feel that we're having fun, so it's elevating the space that we're all in.
Yeah.
And that's going to be great for your business.
Yeah. Totally. I think you're absolutely right about that. Sometimes, right, I mean, these are kind of the questions, and they're questions about like sort of generational shifts in a way, and sometimes I think about what was going on in the 20s and what was the feeling around music, what was the feeling just in the zeitgeist at that time, and people had that sort of thing of like, there was a lot of fun, it was a lot of like, we're going out and we're having fun, and this band is like, there was a lot of music that was a little bit campy in a way, it wasn't, maybe it was not quite as intellectual and cerebral as you and I might be interested in getting now, but they certainly brought fun and energy and this kind of thing, which, so it's interesting to hear you talk about, and it's interesting to hear you talk about this experience of like, being in these situations where you feel like, okay, I got to keep the gig and this kind of thing, and how that really seems to affect the overall vibe in a band, in a performance setting. How does it really feel like that, so
I mean, something that just came to mind is like, there's a danger in that, in just doing it for money, like I think with a lot of people that I witness who do that, they end up becoming stagnant. Their playing doesn't progress.
Yeah.
There's no emotion.
Yeah.
There's little to no emotion in the music that they're playing.
Yeah.
Because they've just worked themselves into this business, and it's not just business. It is a business, but it's not just a business,
Totally. I know. I heard that thing recently, and it was either Wayne or Herbie. I can't remember which one, and one of them made this comment like, if you're out here for the money, you're never going to see the truth of the music.
Yeah.
You're never going to get into the depths of this music.
Yeah.
You know, which is very true, you know. So, and interesting to bring all these things together in this conversation about, like, you know, doing it for the money thing, feeling like there's kind of just a lack of work, you know. So there's not such a surplus there to be able to do that, to be able to, like, be fully expressive, to have a certain vibe around that, and almost kind of like stinginess vibe of, like, I gotta keep what I got, you
right.
know, to talk about these different periods of music when it was just there, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, and hopefully we can bring that, man, if we're gonna do a session here and that kind of thing, and, you know, this place is gonna be here.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, I kind of wanted to tie it back to this place. I mean, yeah, I mean, having a hub like this, you know, I mean, when I met you and then you told me about what you were doing here, you know, I was like overwhelmed with positivity, you know, or just feeling like, yeah, this is great. I want to support this because it's so important if you want to build a community like that, or you know, to have a space like this, that these ideas can, you know, it's like, it's weird. It's like, yeah, while there's the restaurant thing and that can be impeding and all that, like, you know, maybe another place that you might play is like an art gallery, you know, and in a situation like that, that's where you know, that's where you feel comfortable being able to do whatever you want to do, you know, because people are there to listen. They're there for the art, you know. And this place lends itself to that, you know, that kind of, I mean, yeah, it's a listening vibe. It's intimate, you know. I would like to bridge that gap, you know. I'd like to find some kind of middle ground, you know.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I think it can be done. But it all again, like, rests on that, like, that spiritual thing, that emotional thing, you know. It's not something we're not gonna practicing all day on an instrument or practicing scales and arranging things in different numbers and all this stuff. It's like, it's cool, you know, and that's the music that I would love to share too, but there's got to be something behind it, you know. There's got to be meaning. There's got to be, like, it can't just be for the sake of, you know.
Totally.
Yeah, like,
totally. I mean, you're talking about something that's beyond us as well, of, like, changing the way that people feel about music too. Yeah. You know, changing the way that people in your immediate physical community feel about music, you know. Obviously there's a whole community of people interested in creative music and improvised music and all these different shades of it, you know, but you're also talking about just, like, the people that live close to you going out and hearing music.
You know, that made me think, like, I think the musicians that do really well in this area, I think, are more like the singer-songwriter type. You know, I feel like a lot more people, like, for that, like, it's a lot more accessible, you know. Which is understandable, you know. Like, people want to hear stories, they want to, and, you know, there's a lot of the singer-songwriters in this area are very, very good, and they emote through their music, you know. They do that, so why shouldn't a jazz musician do that, you know? You know, there's so many stories we could be telling, you know. they might not have words, but but there will be a feeling, you know.
Absolutely.
And that's something I'm really interested in, you know, as far as jazz music goes, like how it's progressing, like, you know, because I feel like the average listener nowadays doesn't really identify with swing music or the tradition of, you know, jazz, like as we understand it, you know, like we get it and we have an affinity for it because we've spent the time, like, you know, learning about it or listening, you know. But I feel like there's a place for the improvisational aspect of jazz, that being like the combination of improvisation and within structure, you know, because I feel like for it to be accessible to people, it needs to have some sort of structure, you know. But in order for it to uplift people or have, you know, emotion, it's got to have that improvisational,
that freedom side,
that soul side to it, you know. And like one thing I'm really exploring now is, and this is something we've talked about a bunch, is just like I've been trying to come up with a style of improvising, you know, or a rule book kind of. Talio called it a game, you know.
Right.
But finding ways to improvise, to utilize the moment, to utilize the present moment, and express that, because, you know, I think jazz, when it was in its heyday, like, you know, it was relevant to that time, and like it was the music, it was the popular music of that time, you know. Now jazz isn't the popular music, and I don't think that necessarily means that we have to adapt the current popular music, like the sonically what it sounds like, you know. I think that's cool, because there's obviously a lot of cool, like, jazz fusion that comes out of that mentality of like, oh, what if we took this, you know, hip hop and jazz, or like pop and jazz, and fused it together, and it's like that's cool. But I feel like when you're doing that, you're always in the past. You're always taking something that was already created and smashing two things together, you know.
Totally.
But I feel like the real innovation, not that isn't innovation, it's all great. I love fusion, you know. I love any of those things, but I feel like the real innovation comes from whatever's happening now in this moment, and, you know, and then taking the knowledge of what you learned in the past and using that to confront that, you know.
Right.
And, you know, that's because that was something you talked about when we first talked about this, you know, when we first met, was like, you know, I mean, because your whole mission is kind of like blending, you know, the spiritual side with, you know, metaphysics and all of that, with music, with how we can express that musically, you know, which is like obviously right up my alley, you know. And yeah, it's, you know, it's through things like that, you know, because it kind of forces us to go inward. You know, we're not looking necessarily towards, like, externally to, you know, define what it is that we're doing, you know. It's like you were talking about, like, you know, having a garden and, you know, analyzing the crop that you just harvested, you know. And being like, why do we do this during this time of year, and why does this, you know, like that, those are really important questions that, when, you know, you can fuse that into music, you know, there is a sound for that. I worked with a dance instructor for a while, and she was kind of teaching like West African dance, and I was embellishing on those, like on the African rhythms, but most of the time I was just looking at her movements and then thinking like, what can I play? Like her body's like this, so what am I gonna play that looks like that, or sounds like how that looks? Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, bringing those kinds of things into, and then bringing it into a restaurant. Like, how does that, like, it's gonna be tough.
Nobody said it was gonna be easy, man. Nobody said it was gonna be easy. I think all the cats that have paved the way for this kind of thought, were varying levels of explicit about it's not gonna be easy.
It's like we're like scientists,
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Trial and error. Like.
Yeah, exactly, man, exactly. It was funny when you were like, when you hit me up to do this series, you were like,
this was my idea.
This was Brian's idea, everybody. Full credit to Brian, because he sent me about it too. Yeah, but you sent me this text like just totally out of the blue, unsolicited, like, dude, you got to have a tavern podcast. So many great minds there. And I said, yeah, Brian, you're the greatest mind, so you're going first. And this is like very much one of the things that I was thinking about, like, right? Because obviously I've got my own thing that I want to work on. You've got your own thing that you want to work on, but there's so much overlap. What you're talking about now is like, there's not just overlap between us with an interest in this either, because like I know that we've had so many moments even here at the tavern, talking to a bunch of people here, talking to people out on the street, I mean, I've talked to people in different cities that are not even musicians about like, this kind of thing, this kind of thing that you're talking about, being scientific and like understanding kind of what's the vibe of a moment, what's the energy of, a certain plant or a certain moment or a food or any of these kinds of things. And then how do you, the dancer, how does that, how do you make the music that feels of that thing, So, when you talked about doing this and coming together, it's like, man, we gotta talk about this stuff more. And this is like a think tank series in a way to do this, like, just come up with ideas, like how are we actually going to test these things out, how are we gonna get scientific, and that's the interesting thing to me too, is like, scientists have a lab, and they've got their lab that they go to every day to conduct their experiments, so what's our laboratory space? What's our materials that we're going to be working with? What are we really trying to look at specifically, and how can we look at it too? I think there are a lot more tools available to us than we use, So, I don't know if this is a question open-ended, in a way, but like, yeah, what are some of the tools? What are some of the things? Let's phrase it like this. In the next couple of years, what are some of the tools that you see using? Things that you haven't gotten to use before. What are some things that you see available to us now that you see a lot of potential in terms of using as a study mechanism, in a way, to try and get deeper to some of this stuff?
I mean, well, like I already said, the communication, that's a big part of it. Yeah. I mean, because, there's so much, even just saying communication is loaded. I mean, look at how we communicate nowadays. That's like,
yeah.
you know, so communicating in person and being real about your emotions, and being there for others too, and you know, welcoming their emotions, and making each other feel safe, you know. That's a tool. What else is a tool? I mean, if we're gonna get into like technicalities, I mean, yeah, I mean, even musically, I mean, we've talked a lot about rhythm. I think like, I think rhythm speaks to more than just notes on a page, you know, or just a time signature. It's just like there's, you know, like Adam Nussbaum taught me that it's, you know, with drumming, it's like it's not about the notes you play, it's the space in between the notes. You know, and yeah, I don't know, I feel like there's something embedded in rhythm that is so much deeper than that. It's, I mean, it's time. I'm not even sure where I'm going with this. I feel like, I don't know, we've worked a lot on, like, you know, we've been talking about polyrhythms and all this stuff, and I think polyrhythms are really important in a deep way, like that ability to hold two rhythms or more rhythms at once, like, yeah, it kind of like, I feel like the better you get at it, it's like it opens up your focus, you know, where you're not just like singled in on one thing, you know? And maybe that lends itself to musicians being able to listen better to the whole band. I mean, you know, we did that workshop with Jay, and you know, just talking about the aggregate, like that was so mind-blowing to me. It was so cool to have a name, like a name to put on everything, you know, to be listening to everything. Yeah, I think that's something to develop, like definitely the aggregate. Yeah, should we explain that more?
I was gonna say, because I know, you know, we don't know who's gonna watch this right now, but presumably, you know, Catherine's gonna watch it, and she wasn't at this. So tell the experience.
So we had a workshop here. It was like almost a month ago, right?
It was almost 2 months ago now.
2 months ago?
That was like, beginning, middle of November.
So we had J. Anthony Grinelli here, who's the son of Jerry Grinelli, who was most notably the drummer on the Vince Guaraldi Trio records. That classic Christmas record. I mean, everybody knows that. You know?
Been hearing them a lot this year.
It's cool. But Jerry he had a method of teaching improvisation that he taught at a school. I forget the name of the school, but his son Jay, you know, adopted this method of teaching and now spreads it around the world, I guess. But he brought it here, and we had a performance the night before, and then the following day we did a workshop. And one of the things that, I mean, we did a couple different exercises. One of which was just sitting there and basically just meditating, listening to the room, you know. and then we did a couple exercises with rhythm and clapping and where, I don't know, how would you explain that exercise? We had a central pulse, right? Is it
right? I mean, there was the one, and he just like he had his phone metronome, and he went around and gave everybody a different BPM,
right?
And you're just tapping like a metronome, but it's like, you know, one person's got like 84, and the other person has like, you know, 71, and they just phase.
right. So the challenge was being able to stick to your BPM, and while everybody else is doing it, and then be able to listen to all of those individual rhythms going on as a whole. That was what he called the aggregate. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that's like what's happening in any musical situation. You know, it's like, yeah, you're playing the drums and you're playing the saxophone, you know, but like together we're making this thing that is one thing. Mm-hmm. So being able to be aware of that is a tool. Yeah. You know. Mm-hmm. And that also kind of speaks to what I was saying before about, like, you know, how I would gauge like whether like what a good night was for a band at when I was working at Quinn's, you know. I feel like the more connected to the aggregate that the band was, that was also an indicator of a good night, you know?
Yeah.
Because it's not a bunch of musicians individually just doing their own thing and caught up in their head and like they're not really listening to each other. It's like, that's when free music for me goes out the window, you know? Like, that's when I have no interest. I don't care.
Yeah.
You know? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like, I want to hear a group. I want to hear, you know, I don't need to hear three things at once. I've already got that going. Yeah. You know.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Totally.
So rhythm, too. Yeah, I mean rhythm. The polymeter, the polyrhythms, the aggregate. Emotion. Yeah, I think that emotion's like a big thing we could be really be talking about, you know? Mm-hmm. Maybe look, you know, reading down a chart and being like, what is the emotional quality of this chord? Or, you know, what is...
Yeah, sure.
You know, or especially during a solo, like, oh man, like I can't stand a solo that doesn't have some kind of emotion behind it. You know, it's like I look at that moment as like yo, this is your chance to express yourself.
Yeah.
You know? Why are you gonna play this bullshit, you know? Like, yeah.
Yo.
Why are you gonna like obsess over chords and one fast lick to the next fast lick? Like, that's lame. Nobody cares. Nobody wants to hear that, you know?
Yeah.
You know, like, man, just like taking your time can do so much. Like, you know, developing something, or, you know, instead of just, I mean, yeah, there is a time to just go balls to the wall right away, but you still got to be direct with that. You still got to be deliberate about it. Mm-hmm. And then you still have to have a direction after you do that too. Yeah. You know? Yeah, that's the kind of thing I would foresee, like, bringing up at, like, a session like we were talking about, you know? Because there's a lot of that. I hear a lot of that. And I'm guilty of it too, you know? But I don't want to be the only one who's working on it, you know?
Yeah.
But it also, I mean, like, but that's also why the communication thing is important too. Because we have to have an understanding beforehand that it's like, yo, I'm here to help you you know, or like I want us all to elevate together, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and to be open to what anyone else has to say. Like, yeah, there's enough ego in the world, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Absolutely.
All right. So we just had some technical difficulty, and by just had, I mean we just had it about 3 weeks ago. You know, so, but that was the first recording that we've been doing, and I realized that actually I think this series is just going to be a multi-part thing. So we're gonna have to have another check-in interview with you, like 6 months or a year from now, you know, and we can really kind of get that document of the evolution that's taking place, you know, what you're doing, where you're going, you know. So, because there are still some things that I do want to talk to you about, and I want to talk to you about, like, you know, what you're looking at extra musically, some of the things that you're looking at beyond music, and some of the way that you're looking at number and things like this. So that'll be all for next time. But for now, how can people find out about your work?
They could follow me on Instagram, Bry with the Y, BRY. They could come to my jam at Quinn's every first Monday of the month if you're in Hudson Valley area. You can keep an eye out for Dr. Dr. That's my original music. I'll probably be releasing some within this year. Like follow me on Instagram and see what I'm up to, playing gigs. The Mr. Gone Band, Matthew Carvin Band, various other things. Yeah.
Cool. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Bryan Kopchak, everybody. Check him out.
Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in.